In your 1997 Gifford lectures, Genes, Genesis and God, you argued that although strongly influenced by biology, human culture, science, ethics and theology are not explicable solely by evolutionary processes. Since then, have there been any changes in your thought on these issues?
Well, I would say my thoughts have been enriched or deepened in some sense. You mentioned science, ethics, theology. It's pretty obvious to me, increasingly obvious, that many of the enterprises of science don't immediately contribute to leaving more genes in the next generation. And in that sense, if you're thinking about black holes, or even if you're thinking about decoding the human genome, there isn't any immediate or obvious survival benefit to that. Or if you are thinking about justice in the third world, global capitalism, and whether the labor force is treated fairly or unfairly in some nations across the ocean. That's important, but it isn't any immediate survival benefit in terms of the actors leaving more children in the next generation. And likewise, if you're thinking about the relations between theology and science, let's say, what to make of evolutionary theory? Is there intelligent design or something? Those kinds of thoughts, again, don't have any immediate connection with leaving more offspring in the next generation. And so I think in that sense, my arguments have been substantiated and have continued.
So survival, the neo-Darwinian paradigm is fine for genetic evolution, but for cultural, scientific developments, it falls short.
The neo-Darwinian paradigm essentially says the kinds of things are selected that leave the most offspring in the next generation. And I think that's entirely true in the natural world. And there's some degree of truth in the human world with that. But a great deal goes on in the human world that has little to do, as we were saying a moment ago, with leaving more offspring in the next generation. Essentially, the idea is that cultural and technological innovations jump across genetic lines with great speed, whereas genetics is a different process of reproducing from generation to generation. But hopefully the ideas in my book have spread to other minds and jumped across genetic lines rather freely in a short period of time compared to anything that can happen to the human genome.
So there is a kind of parallel in the realm of ideas to evolution.
There's a parallel in the sense that ideas move from mind to mind, but I don't know that these ideas are always selected with reference to what helps the listeners leave the most offspring in the next generation. And so, I'm here today and I'm in the company of astronomers and cosmologists and philosophers and others. It's difficult for me to think that all of their arguments are directed to they themselves having more offspring in the next generation. I think that's just obviously false. That doesn't mean evolutionary theory is wrong. It just means it's incomplete and unsatisfactory dealing with cultural evolution.
And so what have been the developments towards dealing with cultural evolution in the years since you gave your lectures?
Perhaps in the years since I gave my lectures, more attention to making it specific in what's called theory of mind. This is the question whether or not animals have any knowledge of what's going on in the minds of other animals? And generally the answer seems to be little or none. But humans have a great deal of awareness of what's going on in the minds of others. And so there are ideas in my mind at the moment I'm trying to communicate to you. But we don't think that chimpanzees can have any conversations like this. It looks as though chimpanzees may have a bit of theory of mind, if you like. One chimp may know that the other chimp knows where the bananas are, for example. But see, you were well educated, I was well educated. We once learned the Pythagorean theorem that's been transmitted across several generations of minds since ancient Greece. We don't think there's anything like that in the animal world.
Yeah. So you highlight the distinctives between animals and humans, although there has been quite a lot of science emphasizing the continuity. Yeah. But what do you think the fundamental difference is?
There is a lot of continuity, and the protein molecules between myself and chimpanzees are quite similar. And so in that sense, if you want to accentuate our continuities, you can. And you should, up to a point. But there's a point at which it looks to me humans have crossed a threshold that separates us rather radically from animals. We've touched on that already, in that we have the capacity to think in such a way that using language we can formulate ideas and pass them from mind to mind to mind across many centuries. Animals seem to have little or no of such capacity at all, and what that means, in part at least, is that now we can formulate cumulative transmissible cultures, Greek culture or French culture or Russian culture or whatever, and they can be kept in place across generations. They are elaborated and conserved. And now chimpanzees, if you like, have a bit of culture. They may watch each other and learn how to crack nuts or something that they didn't do before. They make this kind of fishing stick to get ants out of holes. So they observe each other and copy each other, but those traditions are not carried on in terms of the verbal exchange of ideas passed across many generations. I think that's a radical difference between humans and animals, and I think many of the scientists are recognizing that as well.
So this major threshold and discontinuity, are we any nearer to identifying the nature of that or not?
Well, I think in part we've explained the nature of it already in this conversation. It has to do with passing ideas from mind to mind. Mm-hmm. Now, if you mean, do we know how that happened, when that happened, I think the answer is we can only speculate. Often the figures given for this transition are something between 40 and 100,000 years ago. Well, if you don't know whether it happened 40 or 100,000 years ago, you can already see that we don't have a firm idea on how it originated in that sense. So in terms of how it happened, I think we don't have a strong answer. Further, it happened in only one species. Now, we did have pre-human ancestors. We're not sure what the Neanderthals could do and so forth. But at the moment, Homo sapiens is one species only, that can do these sorts of things. There have been in evolutionary history maybe 5 billion species. Again, you get different estimates, but 3 to 5 billion species over evolutionary time. And in only one of those species do we have the capacity to do what we're doing right now, which is having a conversation about various ideas and evaluating them and elaborating them. That I do think makes humans indisputably different. And if you listen to certain neuroscientists, they say that's right, humans are spectacularly different. Michael Gazanazis says humans are, in that respect, are light years away from animal minds.
So are we gesturing here towards, I think, what you've called genius, or even the soul, the spiritual component of humanity?
In that direction, yes. This makes possible various human activities. I mean, we can have discussions about death, about life after death, for example. Animals may know that they're going to die. I think they do. Well, that's the reason they run away, when something is chasing them and trying to eat them. But in terms of having discussions about a life to come or something of that sort, we don't think animals have that capacity. That makes us, again, different.
So is there a limit to what we might say scientifically about that threshold, do you think? Or, I mean, obviously we can find out more, but do you think there will come a limit?
There'll be certain limits to what science can do. At the moment, we don't have any scientific theory about how, when, and where we cross this kind of threshold. There are events in evolutionary history that sort of go under the term co-option or serendipity or something. That is to say, there's surprising developments that you couldn't have predicted or anticipated. And there are other developments that you could predict and anticipate. So in that sense, when natural history takes new directions that are not anticipated if you simply look at what's happened in the past, there are surprises in what takes place in evolutionary history. And one such surprise, I think, is the evolution of the human mind out of primate minds. We've had primate minds for many millennia, but as we said, only one of them can do what we can do. Now, is that to be expected? Is that surprising? Is that inevitable? I don't think science has an answer to that. Scientists have opinions about that. They tend rather radically to disagree.
And related to this, many scientists have resisted the idea of evolution having a direction or purpose, and thought of life as simply a happy accident or caused by chance. Why do you think that, you've answered why you think our uniqueness requires an explanation, but what do you think any of this is teleological or directed explanation?
Well, that's a complex question. Maybe the answer, more simply put, is that we may not know whether the system is designed, but we do know that the system designs, so to speak. Natural selection picks survivors that function well, and if they don't function well, they go extinct. So in that sense, the system is constantly creating creatures that are quite well adapted for survival. And now if you want to say, in engineering terminology, that the wings of bats or the wings of dragonflies are well engineered, you can say, well, human engineers would have a hard time doing it better. And I have in mind studies about fossil dragonflies just to that effect. And so the system produces things, if you like, that function well, and therefore they have to be, so to speak, well engineered. Now that may not be intentional, but it's a result of the system. So the surprising creative genesis in evolutionary natural history is that it repeatedly produces things that are smart, that are clever, that do whatever they do quite well, bats fly in the dark and catch insects on the wing. Now, was the system designed to produce that or not? Science may not give you an answer, but science can show you quite well that bats do it very competently in that sense. So now what do we need? We need an explanation for a system with creative genesis that elaborates, generates, and tests new kinds of things and produces a wonderland of diversity on Earth, right? A wonderland because these creatures are quite good at doing what they do. And in the end, or at least in the apex of the genesis that we know, produces human minds that can think hard. The human minds are well built to do a lot of thinking, for example. So my answer is that the system may not be designed, but the system generates design repeatedly. And now I think, well, we need a deeper answer to that. If evolution can't speak to that from a biological perspective, then the metaphysicians and the philosophers and the theologians may need to think more deeply about how it is that we have a world that starts with matter energy, and one planet, and only one so far as we yet know, produces a wonderland of life, and on that one planet produces one species, Homo sapiens, that knows it's on a planet, that can study this evolutionary history and admire and respect it. That needs a deep explanation. And we don't get that full explanation yet out of biology, but biology opens up enough facts, enough panorama, enough richness of life on Earth to prod these kind of deeper questions.
And in a recent book, you've said that the secret of life is that it is a passion play, and that suffering is the inevitable shadow side of creativity, and evolution, of course, involves immense amounts of suffering. How do you explain this, and how do you think it fits into a traditional Judeo-Christian understanding?
As I've been saying, evolution produces creatures that are well informed, well designed to survive in the world that they inhabit. But when they do this, they're always pushed. That's to say, you're on the edge. You are pushing to leave more of your kind in the next generation. You're not necessarily being pushed yourself to survive. You're being pushed to have offspring that are suitably adapted for surviving in the next generation. If you like, you'd say evolution increases the amount of caring in the world. You care about surviving. You care about leaving offspring in the next generation. In that sense, this caring, I think, inevitably results in what? In winning, but also in losing. It produces sentience, the capacity to see, feel, touch, the capacity to have pain. It's generated in the protection of life. But now I want to say that it's inevitable in the long run, where you have a system that's generating new kinds and testing them for survival, that there will be elements of struggle. Now I call that, when I'm in a theological mood, a cruciform creation. That's to say, I find it incredible that the eyes with which I'm looking at you, or the hands which I have, could have been generated outside of that sort of context. So teeth and noses to smell with, and muscles to move around, they are all created in this context of the struggle for survival. Now I put that then, I already used a kind of theologically loaded word, a cruciform context. I put that in the context of what looks to me like what's been a frequent religious truth. You could get it, if you liked, in the Buddhist tradition, with life being suffering and the control and redemption of suffering. But now I want to say I think that figures intensely in the monotheistic context. The name Israel, for example, means the people that have struggled with God. And of course in Christ, the picture of Jesus is one who gives up his life a ransom for many. And I want to say, well, that's been going on in evolutionary history a long time, giving up your life for the survival of generations to come. I don't think these processes are identical in a natural world and in the religious world, but I think they are significantly parallel. So I find the idea that creative genesis involves suffering to be both biblical and biological.
Thank you very much, Professor Rolston, for offering us a view of the threshold of evolution and of the cruciform creation.
Thank you.